So again, welcome back for our third of our four classes on restorative love, restorative justice, restorative practice, loving practice, whatever you want to call it. It all kind of works together there. And this, as I say, is class number 3. And if anybody missed anything from the first 2 classes, those recordings are on our website, so you could go back and check those out. And hopefully you all got in your email today the questions that we will be using for our breakout rooms and your homework assignment for today. If for whatever reason you didn't get those, shoot me an email and let me know, and I can email those to you after the class, so you will at least have your homework in writing there. So anyway, welcome back, Bill. Thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Great, thank you. Welcome, everybody. So tonight we're going to get into some nitty-gritty of how we're going to deal with certain situations, and we'll be getting into shame and the importance of shame and how we have to navigate that well. For next week, we'll be talking a lot more about how we're going to do these practical things and how we're going to actually have these conversations when we walk away from here, when we're talking to whoever we're talking to. We're going to do very small pieces of that tonight just to practice a little bit, and then your homework will be similar to just making for sure that we bring this full circle. So I asked you all to do shimleys. And so I just want to do a quick check-in to find out how you all did with your shimleys. How'd you do with the ones for you? And then, of course, how'd you do with the ones for others?
Are you going to get on?
Does anybody want to share?
Will you just review the definition of shimley so I make sure I share the right thing?
Absolutely. It just means see how much I love you. And so last week we talked a little bit about, you said, oh, that's a random act of kindness. And I said, no, it's really more of a random act of love, because we can be kind without loving. However, it's hard to be loving without kindness. So I just want to make for sure that we're really exuding that Christian love when we're talking about that random act of love, or that see how much I love you for yourself and then to another person.
I think I have a little trouble that I still want to think of it as that I said something nice to someone, but that wouldn't be that, would it?
It could be. It could be, yes. The example I used last week about being kind, the difference between kind and love, was the homeless person. A lot of people can be kind to homeless people, but would rather have them kind of just go away or melt into the background. So there's a loss of love towards homeless people. And so that was the kind of difference that I used between kind and love. So my board president, Pete Allman, asked me, well, what did you do for yourself? Oh, great one. And I said, well, that's interesting that you say that, because self-talk is fine, and I do a really good job of eliminating negative self-talk in my life. I tend to give too much of myself to others. So when people are in need, I give. And then a lot of times my bucket is empty. And so I work part-time for Leash Chicken, just as a side fun job. And they asked me to work on Sunday, and I told them no. And I told Pete that was my loving act to myself, because that's my break to watch the Super Bowl and just take care of myself. So that was my loving act to myself. Does anybody have an example of something they did for themselves this last week for a loving act?
Well, I think I was doing it for both myself and my brother. Intentionally, yesterday was my dad's 100th birthday, if he had been alive. And so we spent time together and picked him up and went to out to eat and then drove around. And he was really filled up by that, and I was filled up by that.
Very nice. So that was both of them.
Yeah.
Gave an example of both. Does anybody want to do one more?
I think there were lots of opportunities this last week, early in the week, to show love towards others by helping shovel snow. We had just a little bit come down, and I did go ahead to my neighbor across the street to offer to help, and she actually didn't want the help, but we stood there and talked for a while, and it was nice to connect with her. So yeah, she was just shoveling the edges so her son could come out with the snowblower.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. So I didn't feel too bad
We
about
got
not getting
snow.
to help shovel.
I missed the snow. I thought we were supposed to get snow this weekend. Was that the snow you're talking about?
No, we didn't get what they were forecasting. Didn't even get the freezing rain they were talking about this weekend.
Which I'm thankful for, because it certainly was quite interesting to have that much snow on the ground. I'm assuming you can all see this. So this was your homework from last week that we just talked about. And so because I opened my big mouth with my board president, he is now going to check in with me weekly and expect me to give him an example of how I'm showing love to myself. So I encourage you to continue to do that, both for yourself and others, just to make for sure that we're just spreading our love to other people. So as you know, the relationships are the most important thing. And so I put this little quote on here because I thought it was perfect for this slide, is as you awaken, you will come to understand that the journey to love isn't about finding the love or finding the one. The journey is about becoming the one. And so to me, that's really restorative. I mean, you're starting, instead of out seeking others to complete you, you're looking for that complement, meaning you're starting with outside of yourself. So if you're becoming the one, you're listening, you're showing that love, and then it will be reciprocated. So this little dog and cat thing, rules without relationships equals rebellion. And so when we think about that, if we don't have boundaries and we haven't set the expectations, oftentimes we get pushback. If we're not allowing others to feel heard and have that expectation, we get pushback. I have a 14-year-old at home and I get pushback all the time. So finding those boundaries and setting those ground rules are very important. And restorative practice is no different. It's about communicating those boundaries. So that's why there's a high structure, because if we can create that, our relationships are going to get deeper and there will be more mutual respect. And so this is a big one: connect rather than correct. So we're not really trying to change people's mind. We're trying to connect to them. We're trying to meet them, trying to understand where they're coming from rather than being the next to talk. So connect rather than correct. And then affirm, then redirect. To me, that's active listening. So if somebody comes to you emotional, our first indication is, I want to help you solve the problem. The problem is, if the person is not yet ready to receive help, they cannot work through it. So the first thing we need to is affirm what they're going through. Oh, that is tough. Oh, I can understand how that is hard, because it gets them continuing to talk. And then once you get them through that first initial emotion, then you can start redirecting and helping solve the issue that is going on and help guide them. You cannot do that until you get them through that emotional aspect. Last week, we talked about affect. So just as a refresher course, there are feelings, emotions, and affect. Affect is that initial response to something that's happening, a stimuli. Feelings are inside, internal, that you can't see, and emotions are that outward expression of the feelings they have inside that sometimes does not match up. So we have to be very careful and start asking more questions and drill down and create a safe environment. According to the International Institute for Restorative Practices, they have identified 9 affects. So all the things that we have, they've identified 9. So I want you to look at these, and then I want you to give me your knee-jerk reaction to that. So up top, there are 2 positive, joy and excitement, 1 neutral, that's startle, and then there are 6 negative affects, as in humiliation, anguish, disgust, terror, rage, and dismay. So what are your knee-jerk reactions to seeing those 9 affects?
My first instinct is that you, on those bottom ones, you're going to pull in, you're going to kind of want to almost hide, you know, if you're disgusted with yourself, if you're scared, if you're mad. Whereas if you're feeling really good, you're going to be really open and ready to engage. Whereas the bottom ones, you're probably not going to be ready to engage or work on anything.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. Anybody else have a reflection?
Yeah. Why are the bottom ones negative?
Isn't that a wonderful question, Linda?
I thought so. Thank you.
So as you look, and why are there so many of them?
Yes, that's what I wondered.
On the other side of things, why have they listed so many of them?
Yeah.
So even in this field, it's heavily upon negativity because our cultures, our society often shoot towards negative aspects. So as they've always said long ago, it takes 7 positives to erase a negative. I don't know if that's true or not, but it just goes to show how damaging negatives are. So I think that's why they decided to put so many of these, is because they oftentimes cause so much harm that they want you to be aware of these. And we'll get into the shame one because that's probably the most important of all of those in there. The feelings are important too. However, usually when there's feelings like anger, there's something driving that. So the idea behind is that we've got to drill further down to find out what's causing the symptom of anger rather than just assuming that anger is where it's at. So it's usually a reaction on why we get to those. I have a question. Does anybody know what dismay means?
No.
It's like that disgusting smell. So when people make that face when they smell something awful, that's dismay. I don't know why it's in there. Again, I didn't come up with these. This is from the International Institute, and very interesting. My concern is that there's only 2 positives that they've identified and are grouping everything into those 2 positives. Because I try to go more positive when I'm finding and talking to people, because most people that I talk to, they're already feeling pretty negative about the situation or things that are going on in their life. And so we usually identify at Lighthouse, Pete does this to my staff and wants them to identify 3 positive traits about themselves. And then he makes them say, I am, in those 3 positive traits, because
Oh, darn it.
Bill, I don't know if you could hear me, but you are frozen. Well, and now he's vanished.
Russ, is that a beer?
Not yet.
Oh, okay. Oh, all right. LaCroix.
I thought about it, but
Okay, well, I
was
think Bill has left and he's coming back now. or on his way
I'm
back.
upstairs. I'm not keeping an eye on him. He's down.
I don't even see,
Ah.
Cindy's not on my screen. I've lost her altogether.
Hey, it looks like Bill's back.
I crashed.
Wow. We just think you froze and then you were gone.
Yeah, it definitely crashed me. So I'm going to try to change my video. Because sometimes when you have more than 9 people on, you can't use high definition videos. And I believe that's what I have mine set at. So I'm going to change that so then we can make for sure that we're good to go. Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. Let's try to get back to the screen. Okay, so there's your 9 affects. So there are these things called affective questions. And affective questions are open-ended because you're trying to elicit a better, more deeper response, usually an emotional response. It allows the individuals to explore in non-threatening ways. So we're using it in a way so it's non-judgmental, so it allows people to open up. And this is what's very important when we're talking restorative, because we want to address the 3 pieces of the current, the past, and the future, because a lot of times we've got to address all 3 of those in order to truly have a future and to move forward together and for healing to happen. We have to achieve that fair process when we're addressing the change. So if we're truly moving forward, it's going to feel like fair process. People are going to feel like their voice is being heard. Responsive, used to explore harm and how that harm impacts others. That, again, when dealing with people, we oftentimes can identify the individual or individuals we harm that's in our immediate path. So if I punch somebody, I know that I harmed them. I know that I can probably say that I've harmed myself in that situation. A lot of times we have to look a little deeper with that, because harm goes a lot further than just the people that are in direct contact. I may have caused harm within that family. I may have caused harm within the church. So it's exploring how this impacts others at a deeper level when we are discussing what harm is being caused. Affective questions. So here's another quote I put on here. God loves you and has chosen you as his own special people. So be gentle, kind, humble, meek, and patient. Again, I think that exudes restorative practices as non-judgmental. We're not being reactive. We're not being emotional. We're allowing ourselves to participate and understand at a different level. So to the left are cards that we typically give for people that are starting out in restorative practice, so they can have some questions to begin when there's harm that has been caused in a relationship or between people. So I want you to think about a time in your life when you harmed someone, whether it was intentionally or unintentionally. I want you to think about what happened, what you were thinking at the time of the incident, what you thought about since that, who's been affected by what has been done, and how were they affected? And then what do you think needs to be done to make things right again? Now, this one you don't need to share, but I do want you to really think about what that harm did, what happened, what you were thinking at the time. When I think back on when I've caused harm, whether intentionally or unintentionally, when I think about what happened and what I was thinking at the time, I can honestly say I probably wasn't thinking very much at the time that I was reacting. Most of the time in anger, which clouds judgment, which then I don't really speak or say the things that I hope to say to achieve my outcome that I wanted to. I just lived in that anger and then acted out in it. So when I think about what I had done at that time, so what I thought about since then is, how can I see my trigger in order to not act in anger, to be able to take that step back and give the person in front of me, no matter what's going on between us, the best of me. And then I think about who that really affects, because I know that what I do affects a lot more people, and I know I represent Lighthouse everywhere I go. So if I have a negative interaction with a community member, that could harm Lighthouse in a big way, just because I'm a representative. So I have to think about those things every time I do something. So then I have to think about, what can I do to make things right in the future? And whether it's with an individual or a larger community, I have to take responsibility for my actions first, and then ask myself what I think I can do to help heal from this, and then ask whoever I believe was harmed how I can help them heal from it. So those are the things that you really need to start thinking about when you're walking into a situation of harm that has been caused, whether it's a relationship or whether it's a stranger. So what happened? What were you thinking at the time? What have you thought about since? Who's been affected? And how can we make things right? Those are the basic questions that we're going to always try to ask. Once you get good at it and have practice with it, it becomes very organic. And it doesn't feel scripted, because it's just a part of who you are, because you truly care about what's going to happen. These are the type of things that we're going to practice next week. So when I was talking about 80% proactive and 20% responsive, do you guys remember the window? And the window, what are the 4 panes of the window?
2, 4 with.
Not.
Yep, 2, 4 with, and not. So as you see, there's a spectrum here. It goes from informal to formal. And we do affective statements, which are I statements, which we'll get into here in a second. Affective questions, which are like what we just asked, is what were you thinking at the time, those type of things. Small impromptu conversations are important, because that's where we want to keep it. Is we want to keep it from going too deep and causing a lot of harm, and do informal circles, which are usually larger, which you invite people to come that were identified that were harmed. And then everybody has the opportunity to have a conversation around what they saw, how they felt in the situation, and what can be done to heal, to move forward, to make things better. Formal conferencing really gets bigger, and that's when you start asking for community members to come in, and that's a much larger group, and a conversation about usually much larger things, like large acts of vandalism that could cause a lot more harm, some hate crimes, that type of stuff. And when you want the victim and the person causing the harm to also be there when it is safe and possible. So those small impromptu conversations that I just talked about, we want to encourage people to communicate with each other. And it's in a way of empathetically, that's organic, that when we're talking to each other, you're really facilitating that relationship. And you're trying to help create a bigger bond that's safe, so people can continue to communicate in a better way. I got to tell you, since I've learned restorative practices, it's only helped me in my marriage, because of when I first got married, I always wanted to be right all the time. And I would argue the fact when I was right. And then there was a switch that I had to decide, do I want to be right or do I want to be happy? Because there's not many things that I need to argue about that really matter in the world. And now restorative have taught me that I don't even argue, that I'm going to start with her viewpoint and have a conversation to then be able to talk things in a different way. And by starting with her, things start really high, usually intense, but come right down once she feels heard. And that's why I always give that opportunity. So usually you're trying to go with lower level incidents so things aren't going to a higher level of conflict. So here's our first activity, and I believe this was a part of the email. And so we're going to change these into affective statements rather than what they say here. So I'm going to read these, and I'll give one example as I move through. So don't act so stupid all the time. You played nicely today. Be respectful. Get out of my room. You're nothing but a problem. Good job. You're a good reader. Be a good Christian. You did a nice job in your homework. Pick up your head. You need to start getting along with others. Get your act together. So when we're looking at affective statements, I'm going to go with be a good Christian, because that's not negative. It is somewhat demanding and judgmental. So I would say, I really appreciate when you show your loving Christian values to others, because that's an I statement, says what I appreciate. And then it also gets to the point of that I love it when I get to see that you exuding your loving Christian values to other people. So when we break into groups, I want you to change these into affective statements. So do you want me to do one more, a different one as an example, or do you think you can do it? Yes, do one more.
One more?
Okay, which one do you want me to do?
Don't
Pick
act.
your,
What was that?
pick your head up.
Pick your head up. Okay, so if we'll say it's a classroom setting, pick your head up, or home, I would go over to the person and I would say, you know, I really appreciate it when you're engaged in our classroom or here at Lighthouse. So I really would appreciate if you could engage with us, because I'd love to know what you have to offer or what you have to say in this situation, because it's important to me. I know you're smart. So anything like that is just engaging them without being demanding or judgmental. Okay. So we're going to break only for about 5 total minutes. So that seemed to go very well. You all did a great job at that. And early on, the first one, I told you all that this is something you do implicitly. So it's fun to see that all of you really got it. It was fairly easy. Some highlights were, some of those hiccups were something like get your act together on how do you do that. The group that I was with navigated that really well. Although they questioned it at first, they were like, oh yeah, this is easy, this is simple. So it's really just being mindful and making for sure we're using that explicit part of how we're interacting with others, and knowing that words do matter. As much as we wish they don't, they do. And we've got to be careful on, are we buying in or feeding into those situations that cause more harm? One of the groups, I said, one of my soapboxes is when people call young people at-risk youth, I actually say promise youth with at-risk behaviors, because behaviors can be changed. Labels are much harder to change. And so being very careful about how we navigate that is very important. And so wordsmithing is important even with adults. Anybody have any final thoughts on that activity before we move on?
I think practice is going to be important because most likely you're going to be facing a face that isn't smiling at you.
Yep.
True.
And so just the emotion and the attitude that's coming from the other person sometimes is inhibiting, and that's when you call in the things you're used to saying.
Absolutely. We go to our defense mechanisms, and our body and our minds want to go right back into that defense mode of I've got to protect myself. I got to tell you, Pam, one of my favorite things in the world is having super angry parents coming into my office, cussing and banging on my desk. I'm crazy, right?
Sure, I'm sure.
No, really, it is.
Really?
Because that's where I get to see the most profound change in such a short period of time.
Oh, that's true.
Because they come in angry and I let them get a little bit of that out. And then I say, now we need to have a conversation. We're going to be respectful in here. If you can't handle that, there's the door. They sit down. Sometimes they're still upset, but you can tell they're holding back. By the end of it, Pam, 100% of the time, parents are hugging me when they leave, because I've given them the opportunity to, one, fight for their kid the way they know how, listen to them, and also give them our perspective. And that's what restorative does, is allow the person first to have their voice for me to then be able to speak mine, because now they feel heard. So it's really all it is. It's scary at first, and it will take practice. The first time you see it happen in front of you, from that not so happy looking face to either remorse or smiling, is when you're going to be hooked, like, this works. So, as I promised, shame is one of the things that is both detrimental to this process and very important to this process. This is what we call the compass of shame. See, withdrawal, attack self, avoidance, and attack others. When we feel shame, we generally draw to one of those things. So, when you felt shame in the past, I want you to think about where you naturally want to go to those things. So the compass of shame, the withdrawal is isolating oneself, running and hiding. Avoidance is denial or trying to mask it through drug and alcohol abuse. Thrill seeking, those type of things. Attack on others are going to be like, I'm trying to turn the tables, meaning I'm going to lash out and try to make them the victim. Blaming the victim. Lashing out verbally or physically. And then attack on self is self put downs, at negative self-talk, or masochism. So, guess what we're going to do? We're going to jump into triads, and this one's going to be a little shorter. So we're going to jump in, and I want you to share what pole you generally go to when you feel shame. So I want you to think of a time that you felt shame. Think of a moment so you can go back there and think of where you naturally went. You do not need to share your story, okay? That's not what this is about. It's about you going back to that period or that moment so you can think about where you generally go in that compass, okay? So we're just going to spend, I'm going to just put you back in the same rooms because they're already created. So we're just going to spend probably 3 minutes in the rooms because we're winding down on time. So 3 minutes, we're going to come back.
Bill, I have a question.
Yes.
Does this group, I was saying one of the things that I've learned in my life is, especially young men, when they're depressed, sometimes they may attack others just by being negative. And then there's the guys that throw the punches or
Right.
whatever.
Yep.
And
Whoops.
there are women that do that too, or girls, but it's less likely. I mean, it's probably 80% of women don't do that, but 20% do. Whereas I think it's probably more like at least 50-50 or 80% of men are much more likely to attack others.
It really depends on the personality, to be honest with you. I found that really, to be honest with you, the attack on others when feeling shame, because you got to understand it's not always about punching or anything like
Right.
that. It's turning the tables, trying to figure out how I can flip this so you're being shamed and not me, and pointing, you know what I mean?
And there's
So-
lots of women good at that. You're right.
Absolutely. So it really is personality type more than it is gender. Because along the gender lines, I have not seen, one or the other, or more avoiding or withdrawing. It's just really has to do with their personality type. My wife is feisty as heck, but she's going to withdraw when it comes to shame, because she's a person that likes that harmony and stuff in life. So she's not going to be a person that's going to do the attack on self or others. She's going to just skedaddle, get out of there. So, and a lot of that's, she's introverted, and that's a tendency for her to go ahead and withdraw anyway, just a safe place. So the reason shame is detrimental and important is because clearly if we're being shamed and we feel shame, like for instance, I always use like at dinner time at Lighthouse, we want it to be quiet so people can talk and chat, but not be loud. And so an instance would be, I yell across the room and say, Cindy, you know the expectations in here. Why are you being so loud? I need you to quiet down, right? So in a room full of 40 kids, I've now shamed Cindy. And I promise you, through their mind, they're thinking about how they're going to stab me with their fork, or just because they're feeling that shame. That's the wrong shame to do. The shame that's important is when we're meeting with somebody, if they feel ashamed of what they've done, and they feel guilty and know that what they did was wrong. That's the good shame. We want a sense of that, because if they don't have that, that's kind of like that flat affect, or maybe a sociopath in life that doesn't care, doesn't think they do anything wrong, and that becomes scary. So that's why shame is both detrimental and very important to what we do. Because if we're having those impromptu conversations, we can discern if they have any shame for what has happened in a situation of harm.
Not unless they're drunk or they're high.
True, and that's probably not the best time to have a restorative conversation, because then there could be safety issues involved. And I always say we've got to respond in those other three windows, right? So if there's safety issues, I'm probably going to be in the 2 box anyway. So because I'm going to make for sure everybody is safe. So that restorative conversation will come later when it's appropriate. So it's not always going to happen right then and there. There might need to take that step back. There might need to be some time in order to come back with cooler heads. Because when emotion is involved, you'll never get it done. And that's why reflective listening is so important too. Share the screen again. So how do we respond to shame? We have to listen. That's very important. Always listen first. And you got to be present. Remember that love, that care. You know when people are present with you, and you know when they're pulling your leg. So be present. You're not trying to solve the problems. Again, you're trying to get through the emotional aspect, letting them talk about it. Even reflective listening on, gosh, I understand how you'd be upset at that. That would disappoint me as well. Because if you don't nail that emotion on the head, I promise you they'll correct you and let you know how they're feeling. But you're getting it out, and that's what's important. And then once they tell you how they're feeling, acknowledging how I would also feel that way, or I can understand how you feel that way. Because if you don't acknowledge it, they can't get through that feeling. So then you can encourage them to talk about what happened and why there might be triggers involved with people in certain situations where you might not have thought that shamed them, but because of experiences in their past, that was a trigger that made them feel shame. And then we want them to get through that experience, because then healing can start within themselves. So effects of punishment, and this is an important aspect, because when we're talking about shame or anything that we're doing, when we talk about just punishment, it doesn't give accountability. It's not giving people an opportunity to even say that they've done something wrong, because punishments are set up to punish situations, not get their side of it, not allow them to take accountability for their actions. So it changes the focus from the harm being done to resenting the giver of the punishment. That's why going in front of judges and stuff like that, or even the people when they are in the courtroom of the victims, they don't feel better about it either, because the victims or the family of the victim sometimes don't feel like it's a harsh enough penalty. So everybody's kind of focusing on the person giving the punishments out rather than working towards healing the harm that was caused. They take their frustrations out on everyone. They change the focus, the harm done. Oh, that's the same. Oh, I have that in two different, or no, it moved for me. No, I have it on there twice, don't I? Change the focus of the harm done. It's just longer. Offender blames punisher rather than taking responsibility, and that doesn't get to the root of the cause or conflict. So the idea is Braithwaite's hypothesis is separating the deed from the doer. So restorative practice allows the act, the unacceptable behavior, kind of that at-risk youth or promise youth with at-risk behaviors, talking about behaviors, to be rejected because they failed to meet the expectations or standard, while acknowledging the altruistic worth of the person and their potential contribution to society. Because everybody has worth, and that's important for us to acknowledge that you made a mistake, we can get through this together, that type of things. So just quickly, I would like to start with Mary, because you're first on my screen. Complete I feel glad when.
I feel glad when I make somebody else feel happy.
Barry, you're next on my screen. I feel mad when.
Did you say me?
Jerry.
Jerry. Yep.
Okay.
Oh, it's Jerry, not Terry.
Yeah, Jerry.
Oh, I guess I feel mad when people don't do what they're supposed to, and or don't show up when they say they will. Those are my big two.
Okay, so Sherry, you're next. I feel sad when.
Oh boy, lots of times. I guess I feel the worst when someone loses something and there's nothing you can do to make it better.
Russ, I feel scared when.
I feel scared when don't have control.
Linda, I'm putting you on the big spot. I feel blank when blank.
I don't even know how to answer that.
Any emotion you want when something happens.
I'm going to go back to the first one. I just feel glad when I spend quality time with my spouse.
Oh,
That's, yeah.
I love it.
Thank you. I do too.
Well, hey, I love it. I love it. It's perfect. So it's important to know those statements, because when you're speaking with other people, especially in the relationships that we have, we need to express those emotions. I cannot argue with my wife if she tells me I'm angry when you, because her emotions are hers. So I can't say you shouldn't feel mad about that. I can't do that. I have to listen then. And then I can start drilling down to say, I'm sorry that I anger you. What is it that I'm doing that angers you? So I can, all of those things. So very important. So I want you to practice these affective statements when talking to people, especially if there's a conflict, no matter how small the conflict, any disagreement, whether it's, I want pizza tonight for supper. No, I want steak. I feel as if we always have steak for dinner. So please work on those affective statements, because next week we're going to do a lot of pairing and sharing and discussing. And I'm going to give you a couple scenarios so then we can try to work in little groups and work through how that conversation could go, and then give feedback. So then the practice is in a safe environment. So then you can go to the real world and start actually doing this and know that you've got it. So we're at that time of night. Does anybody? Yeah.
Can I just ask one question? Do you teach your kids this process? Is it better to have the person that you're having the conflict with understand the process as well? Obviously, your wife understands the process, your son understands the process, but do you teach it to your kids too?
Only as they're going through the process. Typically, we're identifying leaders in each grade that I'm training to be meant, to be the actual peer support. So they're going to run the groups themselves. But no, most of the kids come in raw, and we've seen some of the largest shifts in kids that are coming in raw, that have never had anybody ever treat them this way or use restorative on them. And they go back to school, and the teachers, the administrators are blown away by the change the young person has had in a short period of time being with us. So, and none of them are trained in it, because again, a full training in this is a 2-day, 8-hour training in it to be trained fully in restorative practices. So it'd be nearly impossible to train all our kids in that manner. All my staff are trained in that, but not the kids. It can't happen. We just don't have that kind of time, nor do they have that much focus to be able to do that. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Yep, I will send, of course, the PDF to you, Sue, and she'll get that sent out to everyone else. And then any questions that I have, I will get those sent to Sue as well, and we'll get those emailed to you.
Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
And
Thank
as
you.
always, thank you, Bill. And we will see you next week for our last class.
All right.
Sounds